your house and nobody could see you, you could only carry things that were considered as necessary in your house. And it was limited in many different facets in the house where you couldn't do this and couldn't do that. And I'll get to that in a moment. But here it is that there was all kinds of things. Like a person couldn't light a fire on the Sabbath. Now, you would think that back then they didn't have stoves and ovens and all those things in that sense. And so that was probably essential for cooking. Well, guess what? You couldn't cook on the Sabbath as well. It was forbidden. Or what about that you couldn't do any work on the Sabbath? And that worked with that talked about machinery, it talked about wood, it talked about stonework, it talked about harvesting your crops. Now you're starting to see why it was so important and how they drew this from those disciples picking that grain from that field. On the Sabbath, they also had things that you couldn't walk over a certain amount of distance. There was only so many steps from your house. They had all kinds of silly things that you couldn't walk over a certain amount of steps unless you stopped and ate. And so often they would go out the day before and they would put food a certain distance from the house, and then a person would walk a certain distance and stop and eat, and then they could walk again. This shows you the silliness with some of these things. But the Pharisees had all these rules, all these regulations. They referred to it as the law. Now, we're not talking about written law here. We're not talking about, God's law here in that sense. We're talking about man's law. We're talking about this oral law that the Pharisees intended that to help people understand if they are truly observing the Sabbath, if they're keeping the Sabbath. And so they may have meant well in their intentions, but here it is, they put all these rules, all these regulations of what you can do and what you couldn't do. And so therefore, there was all these things that even today, Orthodox Jews today, they have things called Sabbath mode on some of their appliances. I don't know if you've ever had a Bosch, it's like a high-end, used to have one many years ago, and a Bosch stove has on it a Sabbath mode, meaning that you could set the timer for your oven to come on and turn off so you don't have to touch it during the Sabbath day, so you wouldn't be in breach of the Sabbath. They have that today. I have a friend of mine that's an electrician, and he's worked many times in Jewish homes where they will have him put a timer where the lights will come on at a certain time for the Sabbath and go off at a certain time for the Sabbath. Why? Because they're not allowed to turn electricity on. You see how rigid they are. You see how difficult is this. So this is why these Pharisees now are questioning Jesus about his disciples. And he's saying, wait a minute, if they know the rabbinic law, if they know that this is in breach of the rabbinic law, then why are your disciples out there picking grain out in this field? I mean, it's like a no-brainer. Why? Everybody knows this. See, they were looking for a way to dishonor Jesus. They were looking for a way that they could get this dig at him. And here it is. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is unlawful? They've already made their mind up. They've already said, and they've already attached it to the law. Why are they doing something that's unlawful? Because Jesus takes them. I had to smile because I was listening to Lito teach upstairs this morning, and as he was teaching, he said, I have no answers unless we're going to go and chase through Scripture, because I'm going to take you right back to Scripture. That's where I got to go. And I was like, yay, way to go, man. Why? I didn't tell him that yet, but why? Because that's what Jesus does. And in verse 25, he answered, and he says, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? He takes them right back to Scripture. And in verse 26, and in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, David entered the house of God, and he ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. So here we see that Jesus takes them